All right, we are recording. I think. Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for jumping into the Austin LGBT Chamber Business Academy Lunch and Learn series. We have quite a bit of great information to go over with today, and we'll let you know who the speaker and the topic is in a moment. But I always want to take a minute to introduce the team that is your Austin LGBT Chamber. I'm Tina Cannon, I'm your president and CEO. Helen Petty is your constituent liaison, and Stephanie Pelletier is our marketing and design services. You'll probably see their emails, but it's always nice to put a face to the name. We can't do what we do and all the programming that we offer without the help of our sponsors and our underwriters. So a huge thank you to those who take the initiative to put their name next to ours. So when you are doing your commerce and your shopping and your business transaction, be sure you put your money with them. If you haven't already known about our chamber, we've been around the block a while. We started in 1997. We're on 24 years later. We went from an all volunteer organization to one of the largest and strongest LGBT chambers in the state of Texas. We are very chambery in the sense that we do everything to promote a regional economy and prosperity, but we also do it through the lens of equity and diversity and inclusion. We had last year, in the pandemic year, we still managed to have over 90 events for our members. This year, we're on tap to have 70 events that are already booked and on our events calendar, so please be sure to check out the events for the remainder of the year. 2020 was an insane year, one that will definitely go down in the history books, and 2021 is trying to say, hold my beer. That said, our impact numbers were fantastic. Some of the ones I want to call your attention to is that big 19.5 social media followers. We are the third most liked chamber on Facebook, and that is all of the chambers across the United States, not just the LGBT chambers. 65,000 people looked at our directory for people to do business with, and 75 new businesses added themselves to the chamber this year. So we are grateful for all of our members who have come into the fold. And again, thank you so much to our sponsors for making the work and programming that we do possible. I want to take a moment to introduce our speaker today. Cindy Merkel hails to us from RSM. She is the Great Western Region Leader of Human Capital Consulting for RSM USA. She's got over 25 years of experience in human capital, serving numerous industries, including manufacturing, high-tech, construction, PE, family offices, not-for-profit. She's worked in both multi-state and international companies and participated in everything with startups to M&A to carve-outs. And as a true HR generalist, provides strategic and operational support in all areas of human capital. That includes talent acquisition, management, total rewards, payroll, and all those kind of HR-y things that we all need to have done in our businesses. She holds a bachelor's degree from Texas A&M University. We won't hold that against her for now. And has a variety of certifications behind her name that make her a true expert in this field. So, Cindy, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me, and let me share my screen. And are you all able to see my slides?
You're good to go.
Good, thank you. Well, I do want to give a shout out to one former coworker of mine who I see has logged on, Rob McGee. Thank you for being part of the audience, and thank you all for having me today. So I am a true HR person and really love to support our local businesses, big and small. And what I want to talk about today are considerations. I know that this isn't my favorite delivery format. I'm really more of an in-person presenter. So I would encourage any of you who are participating live to ask any questions that you may have as we go along. So here's what I want to talk about today in the hour that we've got. I want to start with getting it right. And that's all about compliance, and then doing it right, leading practices, and then a little bit of planning for the future. And some of this is Cindy looking into her crystal ball. And some of it are some projections about what we could anticipate politically, legislatively for the year to come. And so I really think that it's critical for any business, and especially small business, to get compliance right. Nothing is going to eat into profits and reputation more quickly than getting on the wrong side of the rules. And so what I wanted to start with is in totally inclusive list of every federal compliance requirement, but I wanted to give you a flavor of compliance requirements by size that you may or may not be aware of, but you should have some awareness of when conducting business and employing individuals. So first is the Consumer Credit Reporting Act. And I think what all of us often realize or may not realize is that if you're an employer that is got employees subject to garnishment, child support, student loans, they're protected by the Consumer Credit Reporting Act. There's also some rules about background checks. We'll talk about those in a minute. But this law prevents you from discriminating or retaliating against somebody that's subject to wage garnishment. So what that means practically is if you get a notice from the Attorney General's office that you've got to garnish wages for child support, you cannot retaliate and terminate that person. You've got to act on that garnishment. You got to set that garnishment up in payroll. And it also limits the amounts that can be garnished from pay. Those are always provided on garnishment orders. But this is a law that if you have one employee to 14 or more, you are required to follow. Employee Polygraph Protection Act. This regulates who can and can't use lie detector or polygraphs and when they can be used. And for most of us, we can't use them. If you have an issue of dishonesty or theft, you cannot compel in most industries an employee to be subjected to a polygraph test. We've got the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, ERISA. This has to do with benefits, medical, dental, life insurance, retirement plans, 401k in particular, and it requires a reporting obligation, informational return that has to be done. Hopefully, if you're in the situation where you've got this reporting obligation, you've got a great benefits broker who's guiding you through this. The IRS, in order for a plan to have tax favored status, in other words, the ability to allow pre-tax deductions by employees, or and the ability for an employer to deduct the costs of these benefits, does require that plans not discriminate in favor of highly compensated individuals. And for benefit plans, medical, dental, life, disability, etc., you are required to test these plans. It's an internal test. It's called sometimes Section 125 plan testing. Again, an obligation if you do sponsor employee benefits. Also is Equal Pay Act of 1963, where equal pay has to be provided for comparable positions based on, and this is gender protection. The Fair Credit Reporting Act, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of this in a minute. This has to do with where you are using consumer reports for employment. So if you are using a third party to conduct background checks, whether it's a motor vehicle check, a credit check, a criminal background check, you are required to secure certain authorizations from the candidate. And there are certain disclosures you have to provide in the event that you're going to take action based on those background checks. I'm going to talk a little bit more later in the presentation about Ban the Box and the city of Austin, but just keep in mind, if you are using third-party consumer reports, you've got some obligations under this law. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938, don't tell my mother, I often remember when this law was passed because it's close to when she was born. And no, she's not listening, so nobody that knows me should be communicating that to her. But the Fair Labor Standards Act covers minimum wage, overtime, and child labor. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because this is a law that trips us up very frequently and can be costly. And again, if you've got one employee besides yourself as a business owner, you are subject to complying with this law. We've got the Immigration Reform and Control Act. This is the law that brought about the requirement to use I-9s to verify the identity and eligibility of workers, but it also prohibits discrimination based on somebody's national origin, citizenship status. With a few exceptions, there is no law that says you have to be a US citizen to work. What the law says is you have to be eligible to work in the United States. And so we have individuals that may be naturalized citizens. Obviously, they have the right to work. We may have individuals that are permanent residents that have the right to work, but we may have individuals that are on visas. Maybe they're on a DACA visa, maybe they're on an employer-sponsored visa. If they have those visas with authorization to work, there are levels of protection against those individuals from being denied employment. We'll talk a little bit more about I-9 forms because, again, that's where we frequently see people getting tripped up, where the results can be, the results of being tripped up can be very costly. We have the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009. And the law effectively says same pay for the same job. But what was more important about Lilly Ledbetter is that it extended the statute of limitations. Effectively, this law says every time you engage in a discriminatory pay practice, that restarts the statute of limitations. Excuse me. So we have the National Labor Relations Act. And those of you that are people who love researching HR issues say, hey, Cindy, that's all about unions, the right to organize and bargain. But what the rest of us need to realize that are in a non-union environment is the National Labor Relations Act gives any employee, whether they're represented or not, the right to engage in concerted effort. Excuse me. It's the most I've talked working at home by myself in probably months. But what that means is that a group of employees can gather and complain about working conditions, and they're protected by that. So just keep in mind that employees do have the right to complain. They don't have the right to be disruptive. They don't have the right to disparage, but they do have the right to engage in concerted effort. Still, if you're one employee to 14, you do have some obligations under the Occupational Safety and Health Act. That's where OSHA comes from, or where OSHA evolved from. And this sets standards for safety in the workplace. And then we have the Uniform Guidelines of Employee Selection Procedures. And this is really about requirements that employers have to follow to defend employment decisions and how we select employees. And really the easiest way to explain this is back probably even 15 years ago, there were batteries of tests and assessments that were used to qualify, that employers would use to qualify workers. You know, some people might call them aptitude tests. Maybe there was an IQ test or two. But in order to use these tests, employers had to defend that these were not discriminatory in nature, that they were valid and reliable. That's the law. This law is what set those guidelines in place. Also, and this may seem kind of benign, it also, even though this does go into Title VII and discrimination based on gender, if somebody said, I need a woman to occupy this particular role, or a man to occupy this particular role, you had to be able to defend that decision. And so the easiest might be, and even though it's a dated example, some of us remember the time, well, we still have them in stores that may have dressing rooms. There may be a dressing room attendant, and a store could legally defend the decision to have a particular gender operating a gender-specific dressing room. And that would be a legally defendable employment decision based on the need to hire that specific gender. And then last but not least, in what covers everybody that's smaller, is USERRA, the Uniform Service Employment and Reemployment Rights Act. And this provides protection for military and veterans, and it also includes our National Guard. And what this means is, if somebody indicates to you when they're applying for work that I'm a member of the National Guard, or I'm a reservist, and there will be times that I'll have to go off for my guard duty weekend or my reservist duty, and in the summer I have to go off for a week or two, we cannot discriminate against that class of employees based on this service. The other thing that it does is, if we have an employee that comes to us and says, I'm leaving work because I've enlisted and I'm going to be gone, and I'm going to be gone for my enlistment period, whether it's 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever the case may be, we have to give them reemployment opportunity. And there's a whole set of rules as to how soon that employee has to come back to us when they separate. It doesn't mean we hold a job open. It just means we have to reemploy them in a position that they would have been had they not left. If you're faced with this, this is where I would definitely encourage you to get assistance, whether it from if you don't have an HR team, from an HR consultant or an employment attorney. Okay, now when we hit 11, let me go back. We trigger another requirement under OSHA, and that's where we have to record job-related injuries and illnesses. You have to keep a log and you have to post a log. And this is another one that people get wrong. I'm sure that many of you have workers' comp insurance, even though in Texas, we're not required to have it. We're one of the few states that are still a bit of the Wild West, where you can go what's referred to as bare and not have worker comp. But you are required to keep a log, and you are required to post a log at a specified time of year for all your workforce to see, to show what our occupational illnesses and injuries look like. Even if you had no, what are referred to as recordable and reportable incidents, you are still required to post the log. So the log may be blank, but it has to go up. Goes up one time a year for a fixed period of time. And again, we frequently see that this is something that our smaller businesses overlook. So when we hit 15, we trigger the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I think everyone's very well familiar with Adea, that it prohibits discrimination against otherwise qualified individuals that may have a disability who can perform the essential functions of a job. Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII, prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex, and religion. And then we have GINA, which protects employees from discrimination based on information derived from genetic testing or history. And some of you may scratch your head and say, well, how does that come about? And some of the more interesting cases that have arrived from GINA may be individuals that have a genetic disposition for cancer. And they've indicated, I'm going to go test for, do some genetic testing because there's a history of cancer. And an employer makes a decision based on that propensity that they could create cost to insurance, and the employer makes a decision to terminate. That would be a violation of GINA. We don't see this come up much, but it does go to how you have to handle information, particularly that may come from a wellness plan that may reveal some genetic testing or potential history. When you hit 20, then you kick into age discrimination in employment, ADEA, and that protects individuals who are over 40. from employment discrimination. And the easiest example that I love to use is, an employer could make a decision that, we're not going to hire anybody under 40. I don't know how we staff a business and what kind of succession we could have, but the only age protection comes when you are 40 or over. So those of you who are under 40, there is something to look forward to as you get older. And it does also protect applicants, which is why, from an HR perspective, we don't want to ask somebody's birthday on an application. Why we don't want people to tell us when they graduated from high school or college, and why you'll see certain applicants start removing prior experience from their resume if it would potentially reveal their age. We kick into COBRA when we hit 20, and that requires employers to offer continued access to healthcare as a result of a qualifying event. Obviously, the one most of us are familiar with are termination. If we leave employment and our employer has more than 20, they have to offer us continued access to medical. It is at 100% of the cost, but it has to be offered. There are other qualifying events that include loss of coverage, a child aging out. That for most plans, that's age 26. Divorce, reduction in hours where somebody goes from full-time status to part-time status. So different qualifying events that would trigger a need for continued coverage. When we hit 50, and if you're a federal contractor, you'll trigger an EEO-1 report. It's an annual report required by the EEOC. That's really a demographic of the workplace by position. Then at 50, we also trigger Family and Medical Leave Act that provides 12 weeks of job protected leave, unpaid job protected leave for the serious health condition of an employee, spouse, child, parent. And then there's additional leave requirements for military caregivers and qualifying exigency. And then we've got Obamacare that kicks in at 50. So again, when you hit 50 employees, you are obligated to offer health care or be subject to a penalty. And it's important that people not confuse the individual penalty, which at this point is 0, with the employer penalty that continues today. Okay, and then when you hit 100, so for those of you who are in small business, there's really no true definition of small business under the law. As you see, there's plenty of regulations that kick in at 1 employee. The only one that really kicks in at 100, the only 2 are the EEO-1 reporting. So every employer that has 100 or more has an EEO reporting obligation. It's annual. Interestingly, there was no requirement for 2020, and for 2020, obviously because of COVID, we think, even though it's you're submitting this report virtually, there was no obligation during the past calendar year. The other obligation at 100 or more is WARN, the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. And this is an obligation under federal law to notify the local workforce commission of a plant closure or layoff. Generally, it's 1/3 of the workforce, a partial closure or a full closure, and the need to provide 60 days notice. The interesting thing about Texas, and Austin, I think, is feeling this more than, Texas, I think in general is feeling it. We're a very employer-friendly state to do business. And so there's relatively few Texas employment regulations that are superseding federal regulation. There is some labor code around discrimination. Again, it doesn't kick in until there's 15 employees, and it really mirrors Title VII. The city of Austin does have a code. Again, it doesn't kick in until there's 15 employees, but it extends the protection to specifically sex, sexual orientation and gender identity. The city of San Antonio also has a similar ordinance, but this is not currently covered by state code. There are child labor restrictions in Texas, and these mirror, again, federal regulations. You can hire a 14-year-old and a 15-year-old. There are restrictions on what are considered hazardous occupations, but what tends to be more problematic is there's a restriction on the total number of hours they can work and the work hours during the school year, which is what tends to make them less attractive hires to most employers. And then there's mini COBRA. So the state of Texas does require a continuation of benefits for employers with less than 20 employees. It's a shorter duration than federal COBRA. Again, something people tend to miss, or they will offer federal COBRA when they really don't have to extend the benefit as long. Again, a really good benefits broker can help you navigate that. Some key Texas employment regulations. One is around deduction from wages. There are certain deductions from pay that you can't make without the employee's permission. You can deduct garnishments without an employee's permission. Excuse me just a minute. I'm going to plug back in so that I don't lose power on my computer. You can make deductions for benefits. You can make deductions for taxes. But what you can't do is issue equipment, give somebody a laptop, a tablet, a cell phone, whatever the case may be. They fail to return it. And in the absence of the written authorization to make the deduction, you can't deduct it. And if you have an employee that is non-exempt, that deduction can't take that employee below minimum wage, even if they gave you written authorization. If that deduction for whatever that amount is, again, not talking about garnishments, not talking about benefits. If you make a deduction for a computer that wasn't returned or broken, or a phone, tablet, keys, credit card, it cannot take a non-exempt employee below minimum wage. So oftentimes we see that employees that are issued equipment and items that are non-exempt, we're eating at termination some of the costs because we just can't recover it. The voting leave regulations do require employers provide time off to vote unless the employee has 2 consecutive hours of non-working time during the time polls are closed. And so if the polls close at 7 o'clock, their workday ends at 5, they've got 2 consecutive hours of non-working time, there's no obligation to give any additional time off. And then last but not least is Texas Payday Law. And Texas Payday Law does have a requirement that if you're terminating somebody involuntarily, you have to make final pay within 6 days of termination. If somebody is voluntarily terminating, then we have the next pay period to make that payment. I've got 30 minutes and I've got 13 slides, 10 of which have content. So we got plenty of time. I want to talk about onboarding and I-9s. And the reason I'm so passionate about talking about I-9s is every employer is subject to audit by Immigration Customs Enforcement. There are certain industries that are going to be at higher risk. If you're in hospitality, food service, construction, landscaping, you are at higher risk, or a government contractor, of being audited. And your size is not going to matter to ICE. And ICE is not auditing solely for the purpose of identifying undocumented workers. They can penalize you for incorrectly completing this form. And this is a form where the penalty isn't one form, one penalty. It's one line of data, one penalty. And so, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but if you get the date format wrong on the form, it's possible that ICE could fine you for it. because they have a defined requirement for the date format. So here's a couple of things, high level considerations about the I-9 form. It is not a screening form. It is a new hire document. So you cannot ask anybody to fill the form out until they've accepted an offer of employment. And you can't do section 1 of the form, the employee portion, any later than their first day of work for pay. Part 2, which is the employer section, has to be done no later than the 3rd day of employment. For government purposes, the 3rd day, if somebody starts on Monday, isn't Wednesday, even though when I count 1, 2, 3, that gets me to Wednesday. The federal government says day 3 is actually Thursday. The employee has to be given the right to provide the documents they want to provide. And so if an employee says, hey, I'm a permanent resident, you can't tell them, well, I need to see your green card. They have to be permitted to bring the documents that they want to provide. And there are lists. An employee can bring 1 list A document. List A documents, in case you're playing HR Trivial Pursuit, is a document that proves eligibility and identity. It's a one document that proves both. A list B document proves identity, driver's license, school ID, voter registration card. And then a list C document proves eligibility to work, social security card, birth certificate. Some of these may be counterintuitive, but again, this is how it's designed. The form has to show date of hire. There's a field for that. And it has to show the date both the employee and the employer executed it, because that's the only way that ICE can determine the form was done timely. There's some other considerations I'm not going to go into, but if you are participating in E-Verify for non-government contractors is optional. It's optional in the state of Texas, unless you're doing work directly for the state of Texas. You don't have to participate in E-Verify. But if you are participating in E-Verify, you use information that comes from an I-9 form. And E-Verify also has to be done in 3 days. So what do we do? How do we get it wrong? We want to make sure that we're documenting information where there's a space that requires data, and that we're doing it in the format that's requested on the form. And I talk about date format. The date format on this form is a 2-digit month, 2-digit day, and a 4-digit year. So it'll show, MMDDYYYY, and the form's got to be completed that way. There are, I think, spots on the I-9 that are traps. On page 1, the form asks the employee if they used a translator to help them fill out the form, and the employee is supposed to check that, and that's frequently missed. And on the second page, there's a line at the top that asks for the employee's name, and then their eligibility code or eligibility, and that's intended to be a number that corresponds with what the employee designated on page 1. Sometimes that's missed. Why is that critical? In the event of an audit, those pages get separated, and you'd only know what page 2 was if you had that employee's name in that section. I'm going to pause, take a breath. Does anybody have any questions? Tina, we have any questions?
Nothing has come through as of yet. I'll hold some of the questions till the end as well.
Okay. I must just be really doing a great job explaining. That's what I'm
You really are. You're actually making me realize that I need to get my ducks in a row, because I too am missing several things from your.
Okay. Well, that's nice. And we've added value today.
Yes.
Okay. So the other area that really trips employers up is the Fair Labor Standards Act. I've mentioned that the Fair Labor Standards Act covers minimum wage, overtime, child labor. So, and minimum wage is not $7.35, it's $7.25. That's a typo on my part. get your pen out if you're doing this. When I send you the presentation, Tina, that'll be corrected. Overtime is time and a half of the regular rate for hours worked over 40 in a 7-day week. And it's hours worked. You don't have to pay overtime for hours of time off. Some employers choose to. They see it as a competitive advantage, but they're not required to. And in the state of Texas, we follow federal law. So overtime is after 40 hours are worked in a 7-day week. That week cannot float. It's got to be a fixed week. We've talked about restrictions for 14 and 15-year-olds on hours. There's hazardous occupation restrictions up to age 17. All bets are off when somebody is 18. There is a record-keeping requirement. You are required to keep records of hours that non-exempt employees work. When they start, when they stop, when they take meal breaks. I'm going to come back and talk about that. So the term exempt comes from exempt from the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. You don't have to follow the provisions. And oftentimes we hear people refer to employees as being salaried or hourly. That's pay delivery. That's how we're choosing to deliver pay. It is not their status under the Fair Labor Standards Act. And so if you took away nothing from today, what I'd like you to start doing is using exempt and non-exempt. Why is that important? Because you could have a non-exempt employee that you choose to pay a salary to. It doesn't get you out of paying them overtime, but it may, we all know that their status, that people think somehow I'm a better person, I'm more relevant if I'm paid salaried. And so we may have non-exempt employees that for whatever reason, retention reasons, motivation reasons, we've chosen to pay them a fixed salary. Because they're non-exempt, we're still going to have to pay them overtime. That could be a whole nother seminar, Tina, by the way, FLSA. We can't have people working off, non-exempt employees working off the clock. They can't volunteer their time. They can't be prepping for work and not get paid. We have to pay travel time for non-exempt employees, but travel time doesn't include commute. So I don't have to pay you to get to work and go home. But if I'm requiring you to travel from location to location during the workday, that is compensable time. And I am required to pay for training time if training is required. If I'm going to do a financial wellness presentation over lunch and I'm making it voluntary, I don't have to pay employees for that. If I'm having a anti-harassment, anti-discrimination seminar over lunch and I'm requiring it, I have to pay for that time. And again, for non-exempt employees, I can't make deductions that take an employee below minimum wage. So to be exempt, this is critical, and this is where we get it, lots of us get it wrong. You have to first meet the minimum salary requirement, which is $684 a week. If somebody's not being paid that amount, you don't pass go, you don't get $100, the employee has to be non-exempt. They have to be paid without regard to the quality and quantity of work. And they have to meet a duties exemption, the duties exemptions, or the duties exemption tests. People refer to it in different ways. There's an executive exemption, an administrative exemption, a professional exemption, a computer professional exemption, and outside sales. These are not based on education with the exception of professional. And they're not based on a college degree, and they're not based on a job title. So I can't call my person who sits at the front desk and answers the phone, my chief reception officer, and say it's a C-suite role and say that that's going to make it exempt. It's all about the duties. I could spend 2 hours going through this, but suffice it to say administrative doesn't mean clerical, doesn't mean administrative assistant. And professional has some specific designations about individuals that have to complete a course of education in order to receive this designation. Think about professional engineers, CPAs, scientists, doctors. I think that kind of gives you the theme. Keep in mind too that there's deductions from pay from exempt employees that could jeopardize their exempt status. And so if, and I'll use my coworker Josh as my example. Let's say that I feel that Josh didn't work hard enough today. And I say, Josh, you didn't work hard enough today, so I'm not going to pay you for the whole week. If Josh showed up at all for work, I can't deduct his pay because I have to pay a fixed salary every single week. That would jeopardize his exempt status. If I told him to go home half a day, and let's say it's a weather issue, and he doesn't have any leave I can substitute, I have to pay him for the whole day. If I deduct for part of the day that I sent him home because of weather, because again, I can't affect pay because of quality and quantity of work, I could jeopardize his exempt status. Okay. I've got 17 minutes. So let me press on to some best practices. I think first and foremost, and this is why I wanted to go through the compliance requirements. You want to understand the obligations for your business and your locations and your size. And I say your business because certain businesses do have some rights and responsibilities that other businesses may not have. So if you're in the restaurant business, you know that you don't have to pay $7.25 an hour. You can pay $2.13 an hour, take advantage of the tip credit. So know what your business permits, what it doesn't permit, and make sure that you're not over or under committing to regulations. Make sure that you're capturing candidate and employee information at the right time and the right way. In Austin, there is a ban the box ordinance, which means you cannot, on an employment application, ask the employee to disclose their criminal history. Now, I'm not saying you can't background check, and I'm not saying you can't ask for it later. You just cannot ask for it at the time of application. You should not be asking for personal information on the application, a social security number, a date of birth, health information. Again, it's not to say you can't capture it, but generally we would advise capturing social security number at the time that we're initiating a background check, and health information post offer, after somebody's been offered a job and accepted the job. That's the same with physicals. You should not be engaging in a physical. We call them post offer. If you remember, I'm doing a post offer physical. After we've made an offer and that person's accepted it, that's the point that we can do a physical. Why? Because at that point we're able to access health information that we really don't want to have, because sometimes it will impact our hiring decisions negatively if we have access to that information. It's not to say that somebody may have a health condition that is disclosed during the physical that may have us have to ask additional questions as to that person's ability to perform the essential functions of the job. But that's a more controlled environment, I would hope. And then we talked about I-9 forms. They're not a screening form. They're to be used after somebody is accepted an offer. Make sure you have an up-to-date employee handbook. And I know some of you are going to say, I don't want to have an employee handbook. You know, we don't want to have rules. I've been doing this a long time. And I can't tell you how many times people didn't want to have rules until we had a problem. And so I liken this to playing a game. I love to play games, by the way. I've got a stack of all kinds of games I love to play, but you know what? I can't do it if I don't have the rules. And work is no different. And the state is going to expect that if you're going to communicate some expectations to employees, that you prove you've done it. And the only way you can do it is to have a handbook and have that employee acknowledge that they've gotten it, that they understand it. And that includes leave policies. Even if you are an employer that has an unlimited leave policy or a self-managed leave policy, you still need to be able to articulate that. The other thing is you have some obligations to provide notices, and the handbook is a good way to provide those notices. If you're subject to FMLA, you have to provide that notice. Now, notices are sometimes posters, but you have an obligation if you're providing workers' comp to let that employee know that you carry workers' comp, because they have the right to waive it. It's another thing people miss frequently. And the easiest way to do it is to do it by handbook. If we have work hours, if we're allowing people to work from home, and I'm saying this outside of COVID, we've got to let people know what our expectations are. So handbooks are good. Read your contracts. If you're contracting with the city, with the municipality, the state, make sure you understand what you've signed. Again, I can't tell you how many times the client has called and said, I was just awarded a job with the city of Austin, and when we bid on it, somebody else did the bid. We said we had an affirmative action plan. We said we had this, and this, and we don't have it. It's not to say we can't get it put together, but it's better to be in a proactive state than a reactive state. The worst situation is when somebody comes knocking on the door to do an audit and you don't have it. Because at that point, it's really challenging to get you back into compliance. And then understand your reporting requirements. Do you have to do, obviously all of us have to do W-2s, but do you have a reporting requirement under ACA? Do you have to provide employees 1095s? Do you have to do 5500s? Do you have to do an EEO-1? Understand what you have to submit and what you don't have to submit. Read your benefit plan documents. Even if you have a great broker, they're going to assume that what they give you, you're reading. And why does this matter? Your documents address critical information such as the age in which life insurance starts to reduce. And I know I have enough time to share this horror story. I've had in 1 year 3 incidents where in life insurance, there were catastrophes around life insurance, and some of them dealt with poor administration, but others because somebody didn't read a document. I had a client who hired a mature employee to be their receptionist, and she signed up for life insurance and signed her husband up for life insurance, and actually paid to have additional coverage for her husband. Money came out of her paycheck. And within 2 or 3 weeks of her starting these contributions, being eligible, her husband died. And she came in to get the claim form, and the employer sent it to the broker, and the broker said, the husband isn't covered. He's 75 years old, and the coverage zeroed out at 70. Now, we gave her, the employer had given her paperwork. They had taken money out of her paycheck. And so she was working from an assumption that she had coverage. And so, what did the employer do? The employer had to pay it. And it's taxable income. And so the employer also had to gross it up to cover the income tax. There's other situations where somebody may have a long-term illness and they're terminally ill, and we've terminated their employment, but we didn't tell them what they had to do to continue their life insurance. And they pass away, and then the spouse comes in and says, what do I do? And they're on long-term disability, because we have long-term disability. There's just a series of events that makes the employee, the survivors of that former employee, believe that there should have been life insurance. And had we read our documents and done what we were supposed to do, there should have been benefits. That's where I talk about conversion, continuation, fee waivers, and early payouts. A lot of our life insurance policies do have provisions for early payouts for people who are terminal, but we'll only know to offer it if we're reading our documents. You want to know who's primary and what coverage in insurance, what coverage is primary, because your employees are going to ask. If my husband and I are both, my spouse and I are both covering our children, who's going to pay first? That's all in the documents. And if you have a 401k plan, you want to know eligibility, what's the definition of compensation, and what benefits people get. Because if we get this wrong, the employer has to pay. If the employee loses out, the employer has to pay. So I know I'm probably doom and gloom, and we may need happy hour after this, but better to try to catch it now than after there's a problem. We want employees to make sure that, again, they've signed their handbook. If they're not taking insurance, that they've signed something saying they're waiving it. Because if we don't have it, then we may struggle to prove that we ever offered it. If you have automatic enrollment in your 401k, make sure you're following the automatic enrollment. If you're disciplining employees or coaching them, document it. Even if you don't have a memo, document somewhere that on this day I talked to the employee about this issue. Because, and I didn't tell you, I used to work for the Texas Workforce Commission, and I used to handle unemployment claims. And if you can't prove to the Texas Workforce Commission, the TWC, that employee knew that their job was in jeopardy, why their job was in jeopardy, and that they had an opportunity to correct it, you're going to lose your claim every single time. And exceptions to terms and conditions of benefits. So where you may have promised somebody more than what is standard, make sure that you've documented it. I will say this, technology does solve most problems. If you're using human capital management system, a good HRIS system, payroll system, it does provide for more accuracy in correct forms. It's not going to solve the timeliness issue, but it will help in getting them right. It can ensure that deadlines are met. And it does, some of these have great workflows, so it doesn't let you circumvent processes. It does ensure a consistent employee experience. And I think it too, you know, especially when we're living in a city like Austin that's cutting edge everything, progressive, you know, the most progressive employers, the coolest employers, we want employees to have a great employee experience. And our technology reveals that. And the ease that we can onboard employees and manage our employee experiences, and it provides efficiency. Lets us be a little bit more lean. So really quickly, what's to come? We know that with Biden taking over as president, and as we now know, a Congress controlled by the Democrats, we know that there will be changes in how the Department of Labor wage and hour interprets law, and there will be increased enforcement. There is most likely going to be an increase in minimum wage. This has been on the docket for years. This is the time it's most likely going to happen. So we need to be keeping an eye out for that. We do believe there'll be an increase in the minimum salary requirement for exempt employees. Right now it's $684. We anticipate that will go up. And so that will make for more non-exempt employees. And the DOL just changed or just issued some new interpretation on independent contractors that kind of loosened the rules. We anticipate that those will become more restrictive. I don't think those aren't going to happen in this calendar year because nothing runs quick in Washington, but they're coming. We just need to be prepared. Okay, questions?
That was super. I mean, you condensed probably a 4-year education down to 56 minutes. So well done.
Thank you.
You also put the fear of God into me on several occasions on things that as a small business, which the chamber is, that we need to be making sure that we've got our I's dotted and T's crossed, just in the event that we're subject to audit, either internally or as a result of an employee complaint down the road. And
remember, if people have this, they can file a complaint. The Department of Labor has an app. And so employees can track their hours on this app. They can file complaints on the app.
Sure. So I'll selfishly go first, even though I see Josh has a question too. And just because it's kind of pertinent we had a session earlier this week with a legal partners of ours talking about the because there's an intersection here with employers being able to kind of what that gray area is to require a COVID vaccine. On one of your slides, right, you talked about you can't ask during the application process. But as folks are starting to hopefully return to work over the next few months, and the employer has a return to work policy that has a COVID vaccine requirement, or as they're bringing on new talent, probably in the application process, is that something that an employer should ask during the application, or is it something kind of like the post-application physical?
Yeah, if you're going to ask any medical questions, we can always ask an employee, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without accommodation? That can be asked during the application process, but we just really don't want to know medical information until we have made an offer.
Right. So there should be,
and even then, yeah, even then, they can check the box that they've been vaccinated or not. But I think to the legal presentation, then it's really what's within our right to do anything about it.
Right.
So again, at the point that we've made an offer, they've accepted the offers when we can start inquiring to job relevant medical information.
Okay. So the question from the crowd is, we talk a lot about the employee's perspective, but what are some common pitfalls of a business as it relates to contractor versus employees, which is probably a whole nother day topic as well. But what are kind of some of the guiding factors on whether an employee is a contractor or an employee?
So, I talk about the trifecta of enforcement and with regards to independent contractors. It's the IRS, the Department of Labor, and the Texas Workforce Commission, if you're exclusively in Texas, or the state taxing authority. They're all stakeholders. They all have memorandums of understanding. And it's not easy and cut and dry. Now, it's easy if you're, I'm going to pick on my friend Rob McGee, who's on the call. If Rob's employer decides they want to hire Cindy Merkel with RSM to provide consulting services.
Yeah.
We are contractors, but I am not an independent contractor. I'm employed W-2'd by someone else. The risk comes when we've got somebody that is 1099'd, and there's a series of tests, and the tests aren't the same between the different groups. But if somebody looks like an employee, we're dictating how they're doing the work, when they're doing the work, we're dictating how it's paid, and they don't have the ability to work for anybody else. You're at risk of them being an employee. And then getting it wrong subjects you to owing unemployment tax, employer FICA, and then under the DOL, if they were misclassified as an independent contractor and they should have been non-exempt, you may have overtime obligations. There have been situations where independent contractors have gone and filed claims for benefits.
Wow.
Maybe there was a stock options plan that people were deprived of, so it can be costly. And I know that when you're a small business and you're starting out and you're resource strapped, it's a good alternative. You just have to make sure that it's compliant and structured appropriately.
Well, it's fantastic information. And thank you for sharing it. As employers are hopefully going to be bringing workforce back over the course of this next year, it's a good time and a good reminder for folks to take a look at your company policies, to make sure that you have all of your paperwork ready, that your application process is ready to accept new employees coming into the fold, and that you are classifying them the right way out of the gate. With Austin's unemployment rate being still lower than the rest of the nation as a general rule, we're still higher than we normally are. We're about double the unemployment. So there are people that think hopefully will be employed over the course of the next 12 months, and that folks that are watching this can get themselves in a position to hire right the first time, because it can be very expensive if you don't.
Yeah, and the expense, Tina, and this will be my closing remark, isn't just the compliance expense, the penalties. you know, in a world where we live in this heavily in social media, people share information, and then, you know, Glassdoor and other sites like that, you know, have an avenue for people to post their experience. And reputational risk is probably as costly as penalties.
Certainly. Cindy, thank you very much. Thank you to RSM, and thank you for being a chamber sponsor. We definitely appreciate your support as a company that's providing a great workplace for the LGBT community. And we are thankful to have strong allies like you joining our call.
Well, thank you so much. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thanks. Appreciate y'all.
Bye-bye.